and then we're just going to move into
Cool.
Indonesia itself.
Welcome, everybody. It is the Thursday edition of Talkback, brought to you by Knife River Residential. Have them install new or repair your home's present asphalt driveway. Plan ahead for your spring projects by calling 532-5250. Selway Armory on Stockyard Road. More guns and ammo than anyone. Missoula, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Missoula Nissan Hyundai. Drive the adventure in the big store on Brooks, where they have the largest selections of Nissans in the state. Missoula's Office City, where they make your office their business for over 100 years. Shopping online for free next-day delivery. And by Far Side Sign, Missoula's leading full-service sign and custom vehicle graphic shop located on South Avenue West. All right, here we go. Oh, gosh. That was so loud. Goodness gracious. I need to learn to clap like they do on screen. Anyway, John King is right over there. Good morning, John.
Hey, good morning.
We have
Maybe you need to snap.
Yeah, they're
like
beatniks,
jazz
like
club
beatniks.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Hey, boss, man. Anyway, we've got Mehrdad and Gigi are saying, can we just leave now? All right, Mehrdad, Key, and Gigi Weix. Good to see you guys again.
Thank you very much. Good morning to both of you, Peter and John.
And
Nice
how are you, young lady?
I'm happy to be here.
Good. All right, so we are here to talk about, what do you guys want to talk about?
So for the next several sessions when I'm here, we're going to hop around the world and bring out
no passports required.
Exactly, without passport or visa.
So the Americans.
Yeah. Some of the very important countries which seem to be ignored in our, general discourse these days. And these are not only rising powers, but these are major powers in various different corners of the world, for the lack of the word. And these include countries like India, like Brazil, like South Africa, for example. But today our focus will be Indonesia, a major player in world politics, but also a major powerhouse in Asia and especially in Southeast Asia, a country of, Gigi, correct me if I'm wrong, 13,000 islands, right? And 260 million people, which makes it, I think, the fourth largest country in the world. And the most populous island in the world, Java, right? Yes. And is Jakarta still the capital, or has
it
the
is.
capital?
Jakarta on the island of Java is still the capital, but there are plans to move the capital to the province of Kalimantan on the island of Borneo.
They're going to Jerusalem, I hear.
Now, what is so important about this country, it also has a very, very diverse ethnic, linguistic, and cultural population. It has the largest Muslim population in the world.
85 to 90% of the population affiliates with Islam.
Yeah,
there are
10% Christianity.
Significant minorities for Christianity, also Hindu.
Yes.
On the island of Bali. And enormous number of animists, because historically the archipelago was filled with people with their independent society.
And a tumultuous history, because it gained its independence officially in 1945, I believe, after the withdrawal of the Japanese. And Gigi will talk about this, but it had a tumultuous history because in mid-1960s, it also had a major coup, which resulted into the death of 500,000 to 1 million folks, many of them affiliated with the Communist Party of Indonesia, not all, and brought a military dictatorship under General Suharto, which lasted until 1997-98, when the country then began to move into a more democratic system of government, especially after 2004. But Gigi will talk about this and give us a sense of why Indonesia is so important, but also why, for example, Australia is so frightened by the rise of Australia, by the rise of this new Indonesian power, and why should we be involved in understanding the rise of this new superpower in that part of the world. Yes.
And I'll just say the power of Indonesia is its location. It's an archipelago, the largest and most important archipelago nation because of its shipping lanes between China and the Indian Ocean. And the Republic of Indonesia declared independence in 1945, August 7th, but did not actually achieve their independence until 1949, 1950, when they were recognized by the United Nations. So they celebrate their independence from 1945. And as the fourth largest democracy, also one of the largest democracies of the world, they did have a period of democracy up through the 1950s under the first president, Sukarno. But starting in 1957, he created an increasing set of powers and restrictions on the democracy.
They call it the rise of authoritarianism.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And the coup that you're alluding to in 1965 was preceded by a period of several months in which about between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed by Indonesians themselves. It was internal to the country. And
so it was a civil war, basically.
Well, you wouldn't even call it a civil war because the army and the government were helping all of these different local organizations, mostly young men.
So who were the victims? Who was
the
killed?
victims were ordinary Indonesians who either belonged to the Communist Party. At the time, it was a legal political party with almost 30 million members, or who were simply accused of being communists. And the massacres that occurred throughout the archipelago, primarily on Java, Bali, Sumatra, and Borneo, they had also local dimensions. So it wasn't just a political
settling some.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, 50,000 people died in Bali, but that was not a place that Communist Party was strong. It was much more of an.
So, question for you.
Yes.
Except for when other powers have problems with piracy, when does Indonesia register on the international news front? Like, it just seems like one of those countries that's in between China and Australia and Japan and India, but it's something that I don't hear a lot. Oh, the Indonesians have launched a rocket into space, or they found a new octopus, or whatever.
Their power is trade and location, shipping lanes through that country. Indonesia is not. They declared themselves a sovereign archipelago so that they claim sovereignty over the waters of their. And so, with all those 13,000 islands, it's also the seas around that makes them significant as a power. So they don't have a strong military presence in the world. Their power is economic and trade related.
And that's what attracted the Dutch, right?
That's right.
Initially, and in the 17th
the
century.
Dutch East Indies, right?
Yeah, and
right.
Starting in 17th century, they came under Dutch rule, and it lasted until Japanese occupation during the Second World War. Yeah.
The Dutch and Portuguese came in the 16th century looking for spices and settled, all along the coasts of the archipelago and claimed it as a colony. So when Indonesia speaks of its modern history, they always say we're 350 years of colonization. But that colonization was very fragmented throughout, different on all the different islands.
It wasn't a military conquest in any way. It was just, hey, we're here, may as well call it ours.
And it was a fascinating kind of colonization, indirect rule, they called it. So Indonesia's era of rise, if you will, in the 20th century, was their rise to nationalism, which came primarily through education. There were Indonesians who, at the time, Indonesia itself as a term didn't exist.
Right.
They were Javanese and Sumatran and Balinese, and they went to Europe and education, learned about democracies, came back and created the new vision of themselves as a prospective nation.
Okay, we're up against a break, and I hope you're taking notes. There will be a test just before 10 o'clock this morning. So anyway.
You're going to have to build your own house out of a tree.
Yes, and if you don't get 100%, you don't get to have recess. We're going to come right back with more of Talk Back, our special guest in studio. By the way, if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you, especially if maybe you've lived in Indonesia, if you have relatives or friends there or business there. 721-1290 is our number. We'll be back.
I think we should switch my.
Yeah, I think so too.
How is
You should be better with this.
soft?
Oh no, she's fine. It's just a bad microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, your mic level is fine.
Okay.
This one's obnoxious. It's for obnoxious people. We're quite there.
Okay. Okay.
Right about there.
Great.
Who was it? I think it was Owen Sears. so
Oh, yeah.
softly.
Yes.
And finally Peter had us like next to it. Yeah.
So you have the most powerful mic, but then you have
Oh,
a
I see.
powerful voice. So
Oh, okay.
sorry, looking for music to come back into the program with.
Clap it out, Peter.
Yeah, I could do that.
So April 19th, Thursday, is it? No,
What?
no, it's the conference time, and we wanted to make sure that our friend from Syria will get a show. What do you think? Yeah, is it open?
Typically, I have.
Yeah,
Here we go.
thank you.
And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Mehrdad Kia, Gigi Weeks, joining us, anthropology professor at the University of Montana. We're talking about Indonesia. John King is over there. And so let us continue. Now, let me ask you, the name Indonesia, where it's obviously an amalgam.
Yes.
So how did that come about?
Yeah, it was created to reflect the Dutch. We're calling it the Netherlands East Indies, but the term first came in 1913 from this educated elite who wanted to create a new vision of their future, something that was no single ethnic groups. So they didn't call themselves the Javanese or the Sumatran. They wanted a name that would reflect a shared future. So they created the notion of a name, a language, and then a possible independence from Europe.
So, question for you.
So it means the Indian islands, right? I mean, basically.
It means
that,
archipelago, the Indian
archipelago. Yeah.
But it also, the language Indonesian is Old Malay that was spoken by no one as a mother tongue. So it was a second language for everyone. It is the most successful national language in the world.
Wow.
Within 40 years of public education from 1945 until the end of the 20th
So
century.
they almost imposed it, right, as the national language. They brought it up.
They brought it up. It was a lingua franca everyone knew, but every Indonesian is bilingual because they have a local language that they speak, Javanese or Balinese, and then they have Indonesian. And more recently now, the global language of English, too.
So let me ask you this. So you got, 1,300 islands or whatever? I guess
13,000.
13,000. Wow, that's a lot of islands. It's like the 10,000 lakes in Minnesota. You just put one together and you have flat land. But you've got this situation where, from what I read, there's areas that are very densely populated by Islamists, and then you have less of that it looks like as you head eastward. And I guess my question for you is, how organized is the government? Is it kind of like disparate rule? Is it like states, each island has its own system, or does everyone work together under a collaborative head, or what?
There are provinces. There are 35 provinces. And you're right that the western half of Indonesia, Sumatra and Java, are heavily, populations are almost heavily Muslim. Eastern Indonesia, less so because they were proselytized to Christianity and Catholicism. And then Bali is Hindu. So there is a religious pluralism, but this national creed of unity in one is what gives everyone a sense of national experience transcending their religious differences. And it's one of the most successful cases of religious pluralism as well.
Unity in diversity.
Unity and diversity is their creed. Since 1998, with the fall of the New Order regime under General Suharto, who was president for 37 years, they had a devolution of power out to the provinces. Prior to that, the 20th century, most of the economy was focused in Jakarta and Java, and the devolution of economic and political power out to the provinces was kind of irrevocable. It's why the democratization of Indonesia has been so successful in the last 20 years.
And Gigi, Indonesia has always had a very strong Chinese community. And
Yes.
part of it was victimized during the
Right.
coup after 65, almost
Well,
as part of, kind of suppression. But the Chinese community has played a very important role commercially, economically.
whose ancestors migrated
Yeah.
to Southeast Asia, lived in Java for sometimes hundreds of years, and spoke Javanese and then Indonesian. So it's only 3% of the Indonesian population who's Chinese heritage, but they were extraordinarily important to the rise of Indonesian capitalism in the 20th century.
So Elena points out that Barack Obama,
Yes.
childhood home was in Indonesia. Has that relationship between the United States and Indonesia changed after Obama's presidency, or did that pop up at all on their radar?
Oh, it certainly did. They claimed him as, one of their own because he came back and visited and spoke Indonesian and remembered his childhood there. Indonesians have an extremely positive view of the United States. They always have, but it was heightened during those 8 years. And they see themselves as a modern, democratic, pluralist country that has good ties to America, in part because of
And
that relationship.
For a time, wasn't it called the United States of Indonesia? I mean, they used that word. Yeah.
Like many new nations in
Right.
the world, they modeled, the Philippines also
Yeah,
attempted
after
to
United-
model their democracy as a new nation after the United States.
This is fascinating to me because what you have just said something that a lot of people didn't know. Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world, right?
Well, it's the largest percentage of their
Yeah,
population.
And
So-
and so when we hear about the Middle East and all the rancor that's going on there between the warring factions of Islam, does the same? What I hear happening in Indonesia is I never hear that. You've been talking about the fact that it's a democracy. It's there's so many positive things happening there. So is there a push by the Islamic population to center power in that particular religion, or do they keep their hands off?
Historically, that battle was fought in the 40s when they had a struggle over whether or not to become a secular democracy, a republic of Indonesia, or an Islamic state. And the Islamic State model failed. So
But there is still
was decided then politically. However, there has been a reform movement since the 90s as well, and Islamicists have moved much more into politics as the country opened up, and they have had much more contentious.
I think it's Asian, or it's to the far west of the stretch of
Aceh.
land. Aceh.
Aceh.
Thank you.
Yes.
Anyway, this particular area is the
Christian,
most devout.
It has Christian population, doesn't it, Archie?
but it's
In
run by
central
the.
Sumatra,
So,
there are
yeah.
Christian populations, but Aceh was one of the old sultanates,
Yeah.
Muslim states for 1,000 years.
And in this part of Indonesia, it's Sharia law, both for the actual legal system and for the personal legal system. So it's very densely ruled by. And recently they made it so that if you fly to this region of Indonesia and you happen to be female, you need to wear your headscarf. And I guess I was wondering, is this branch of Islam that it is kind of far away from Saudi Arabia in some geopolitical senses? Is it Sunni or Shia or some kind of special different thing, or what?
When you speak of Islam in Indonesia, you have to remember that Aceh, for instance, has much more autonomy and independence, even from Indonesia, over the last 100 years. They fought the Dutch for 30 years in the 19th century. They were never conquered by the Dutch. So the Acehnese also were some of the strongest nationalists. The difficulty was that Aceh, in struggle with Indonesia over the 20th century, had a civil war running for most of the end of the 20th century. It ended in 2004 after the tsunami because 170,000 people died, and they negotiated peace with the Indonesian government. So Aceh as a province does assert its autonomy in some ways, but it is still part of the Republic of Indonesia, it still obeys national law.
Okay, we're up against a break. Louis is also waiting on the line, and we're going to come right back with more of Talk Back in a moment.
So the Christian-Muslim tension that erupted at one point and became kind of violent, is that because of this more traditionalist point of view about Islam?
I'm going to ace out one of these PSAs because we went long.
Well, religious tensions in Indonesia are cast as Christian-Muslim, but they often have local character as well. So in Maluku, in the eastern part of the country, those tensions they've been long-standing, 25 years.
How much time have you spent there?
3.5 years.
Wow, I was going to say you're
2 years
so well
in
versed.
Java and a year in Bali. But
Wow.
but anthropology, we spend a lot of time at the local level, so it's sometimes hard for me to talk at the national.
Yeah.
Yes. Because Portuguese were there as well. The Portuguese colonized East Timor. No, because they were Calvinist. So they didn't think there was any point. It's predestination. So they didn't bother converting anyone.
Although there is a very small Protestant.
There is.
Population.
Most of the conversion Indonesians, especially in the eastern part, is from evangelical Christians in the 20th century. And they went out and settled in many different places. And then the Catholic conversions happened mostly in Flores and Timor, in the central part of what's called the Lesser Sunda Islands. So Timor, which is half an independent country, is almost completely Catholic.
No, there's East Timor.
East Timor and West Timor is part of Indonesia.
I heard about East Timor.
East Timor is its own country.
Right. Okay. Okay, we're on in 12 seconds. We're going to get Louis on. Hey, we are back on Talkback 721-1290. Kind of a short segment here because we went a little bit long on that last one, but let's get right to the phone and say good morning to Louis. Hi, Louis.
Hi, good morning.
What's up?
Good morning to everybody. Yeah, I got a couple questions. Thanks for having this topic. It's kind of interesting, really interesting, actually, because I'm curious, number one, why in fact does Indonesia seem to have a play in America's policies? And in fact, if they do, I'm not sure I really know an awful lot about that, but I'd be curious to know the significance of Indonesia's connection with our foreign policy. And I know it's all, and the way you already talked about how it plays into Southeast Asia. But number one, why is it so important to America itself? And how does Australia and Indonesia fit together in this little scheme? Do they cooperate together or not? Or is there competition? Or do they represent a threat to each other? I'm real curious about that.
Okay, so, and we're going to answer out loud in exactly 1 minute because we have a hard break coming up in about a minute. So go ahead, Gigi.
For Indonesia's importance to America, I think it is as a model of a country that is not expansionist or threatening its neighbors, that it provides a model of a pluralistic modern democracy. For instance, when they instituted health care, their version of Obamacare, it went out to 60 million people, and some of the people I visited last summer, they were just extraordinarily pleased with their new healthcare system. So I think it's a model for us as another democracy that works. In terms of their relationship to Australia, most of the collaboration of Australia and Indonesia is over the resources in the seas between the two countries, the oil that is also claimed by East Timor. But Australians study Indonesian in high school. They know Indonesian history. They visit Indonesia. It's right next door, and so there's a lot of tourism. And, in terms of, I don't think it's so much that there's tension between the two countries, although obviously there would be between neighbors, but it's not the kind of tension that we have with Mexico, for example.
Yeah, they have a border wall called the ocean.
That's right. They also know more about each other. And I think that's really extraordinary and important, that if you go to Australia, children and parents, studying Indonesia, they visit it, they think of it as, and the universities teach Indonesian studies. There's enormous number of Indonesians who work and live in Australia. So I think that's
So
a
they're
positive relationship.
they're competitive neighbors. How about that?
Yes.
I'm hearing Kumbaya and Rosie, and I'm wondering maybe after the break we'll get into some of the dirty details here.
Well, we're going to come right back. Keep talking about this. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. We'll come back after the top of the hour.
I don't frankly know Australian-Indonesian relations. I mean, there was an Australian information officer who was part of our language group this summer, and he was pretty close-lipped about. He was more.
You opened up the show by saying Australia.
I said it.
He
Oh,
said,
you did.
Yeah.
maybe you can say what you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been always this kind of, while Gigi's statements are correct, there is also this kind of horror scenario. If Indonesia becomes destabilized, given the amount of, the population, mass, exodus from one of these islands, if there is, religious warfare or, local, conflict, but also Indonesian military power, eventually out of demography, they might need more land to colonize. I mean, these are
But
the horror scenarios.
geographically, they would go north.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
they-
But
they
I
just-
think some of it is just the fear, right, of Indonesia's power and so on and so forth. And also, as long as East Timor was the unsettled conflict, Australia supported the movement for independence. Indonesia, of course, claimed East Timor. So I think that was another aspect of it. But that tension being resolved to a large degree has helped Australia and Indonesia become much closer as partners rather than as contenders. Yeah.
This Australian officer talked much more about the destabilization in the United States in the past year over our Pacific policy. I mean, they are much more concerned. He said that Australians are much more concerned about what the U.S. and Australia's relationship is going to be in the future, because there was this pivot to the Pacific 4 years ago that hasn't happened.
I was going to say, we didn't do that. Remember we hit the Russian reset button and we hit the pivot.
But we have,
Apparently it was all just like, I'm just going back to doing what I do in Syria.
yeah, I mean, we are losing our presence in the Pacific. And, TPP down and everything now, it's we're just not there.
And I
so
think,
China's filling in the void, is she?
yeah,
China is trying.
Yeah.
I think other countries like Vietnam
yeah,
are going to be significant. Japan, and Indonesia was not part of TPP.
Right.
So Indonesia might potentially play a part in the future to whatever trade agreements.
So it would be helpful to curry their favor.
Well, we have a good relationship now with them. Why don't we build on it?
Right.
Well, what did they export? I guess they have oil and gas, but not like huge outflows.
Palm oil.
Palm oil
It's pretty big.
in Asia, but not here.
Oh, take a look at your grocery store.
Palm oil?
Palm oil's in everything.
All right. That's their biggest export, palm oil?
It's one of the big agriculture.
Is
I mean,
it also timber also big time?
You know what?
It-
Actually,
and it's now being replaced with palm oil plantations. And metals. There's copper and gold, and the mining in Papua New Guinea is significant. But the exports of Indonesia is not as important as its market. It is a rising middle class market for us. That's where Indonesia might.
So the Indonesian government lists it as crude oil, natural gas, tin, copper, gold.
oh, sorry, because I keep stepping off my mic, Elena. I forget you can't hear me on the other speaker.
I think it's time for us to do a show from Indonesia.
You know what? I'm sure
They
that we can get
also
the capital
export rubber
expenses.
also?
Yes.
Yeah, because of,
I almost got to go to Lolo once, so maybe.
It's easier
and they
than
have
you
fabulous
think.
textiles, which
It's
they also export.
Easier than you think to go to Indonesia. I have good friends from Wisconsin who've lived in Jakarta for 30 years. I was visiting them in Jakarta.
Okay.
Jakarta is a little sea of neighborhoods. It's a
Huh.
lovely place to visit. So
So
Interesting.
I mean, is it a typical climate for like Australia or what?
Yeah, it's tropical. So there's wet season and dry season.
Right.
It's pleasant, moderate heat.
So they're like, are the resorts there?
There are resorts, but I don't recommend them. I recommend you visit the local people.
Yeah. Okay.
It's much more comfortable.
Bali was
All right.
the biggest.
Yeah.
Is there a white-walled room that I could go hang out in for a week? And
There's lovely verandas to sit on and listen to the birds. Have good Indonesian food. They have a day now.
So
The president has
what is
instituted on
Indonesian
Sundays, Sunday mornings, no traffic in Jakarta on the main thoroughfares. Everyone goes out and walks and bikes on the highways.
Wow.
He did that in Solo when he was mayor.
Yeah.
Then he governor of Central Java, and then he moved to
That's
president.
very healthy approach.
And we went and biked down the main thoroughfares Sunday morning, and it's
Wow.
like a huge party all Sunday morning.
How about that?
Incredible.
is it the whole day Sunday?
No, just 6 hours.
Oh, okay.
But people up in the high-rise hotels are trapped because they can't get out. Like,
Right.
no cars.
I can totally
That's
see.
what
I can totally see
Jakarta.
our mayor coming up with this plan.
Well, if it's as much fun, I would do it.
Except that he would not walk or bike because
He
he can't.
should.
So Peter asked about what is the kind of typical Indonesian food, right?
Yeah.
Dishes. Yeah.
Chicken kebabs, rice.
Okay.
different
Peter's
kinds
got
of
sold on
tofu and
chicken
tempeh.
kebabs.
Yeah. And
I'm a big Hoagieville chicken strips guy.
but
Here we go. Stand by. If it's deep fat fried and cheap, I'm on it. Okay, here we go. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Talkback, brought to you by Missoula Nissan Hyundai, Knife River Residential, Selway Armory, Missoula's Office City, and by Far Side Sign. Okay, we are back on Talkback. John King's right over there. I'm Peter Christian, Mehrdad Kia, Gigi Weeks. Good to see you, anthropology professor. We're talking about Indonesia. Go ahead, John. What do you
Yeah, is it Weix or Weeks?
Weix.
Weix.
Weix, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Thank you.
It's Weeks. Weeks and the Vonettes.
How many names can I get wrong this week?
It's been a tough week for Peter. Question for you though, from our website from Facebook here. Elena wants to know, why is Indonesia's drug problem getting worse despite, quote, shoot-on-site orders and draconian drug laws?
I think Elena might be thinking more of the Philippines, where they are. President Duarte in the Philippines is instituting a drug war against his own people, and thousands of people have been shot and left. Indonesia's drug laws are very strict, and they do have, like any modern industrial country, has drug problems, but it's a very different order. And the rule of law in Indonesia is much more evident than it is in the Philippines right now.
Well, when you talk about the rule of law being evident, I remember not too long ago, like the caning of homosexuals and some pretty, what we would think of severe punishments. Is that still kind of the way of the law?
That has been an extraordinary and an unusual development over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, violence against homosexuals was unheard of in Indonesia. And then suddenly one incident occurred. And today, 2 decades later, the parliament is considering laws against gay sex, but also against any sex outside of marriage.
Wow.
And so there is a kind of new prudish, puritanical stream of criticism that is producing both provincial punishments that you're describing in Aceh. There were men who were caned.
Well, you said in Aceh.
In Aceh,
so
in the provinces.
That's
but
the Islamic section. So is this part of an Islamic ethos spreading to the rest of Indonesia?
Gonna be my
well,
question.
it's interesting. What I've been reading is that the criticism or the impetus for these new laws is coming from the top. There's a great deal of foment and debate among the population as to whether or not they would want to go to these kind of draconian punishments that are much more indicative of other Islamic states. This is a democracy, and people are debating it in Parliament. So it is much more. There is much more violence against individuals. It's much more difficult for people to feel safe in cities, and there are more instances of some provinces taking those kind of measures.
And usually the Indonesian military always played a very important role. Suharto himself came from the army. And so what is now in this new, quote unquote, democratic sort of system that is developing? What is the role of the Indonesian military? Because it is known as being a very formidable military force. And going back to Louis' question, it's one of the issues that the United States looks at very seriously, because it's not only an emerging political and economic power, it's also a significant military power. Yeah.
Since the beginning of the Republic, Indonesia's military has always had what's called a dual function, a positive, constructive function in society as well as a one of defense. And since they have not been engaged in as many conflicts with their neighbors, or their other role was pretty much in the government through the 20th century. But since the reforms of 1998, the military has had to shift and pivot again to a much more transparent, open role, and they've had much more investigations into corruption. What's so interesting about Indonesia today is the process they are undergoing to try to address the problems of corruption in their country, including corruption in the military.
I was going to ask you what, since they're an island nation, they have a significant navy, or what? They do. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, just to get to work, because they're all islands.
Yeah. So I was wondering, where do they get their military equipment and?
Well, the U.S. has had a longstanding alliance and training, but I think it's important to remember that their military experience came out of the revolution, which was part of following the Japanese occupation from 42 to 45. So Indonesians as veterans trace their origins back to that revolution against Dutch imperialism. And my friend Mary Steedley at Harvard just published a beautiful book called Rifle Reports, looking at oral histories of women in the Indonesian military back to the revolution, because both men and women fought in the revolution. And then as the military emerged through the 20th century, it was an institution that almost all Indonesians have some connection to. The difficulty was that period from 65 to 98 was one of authoritarian rule. And coming out of that, the last 20 years, they've had to reform themselves, to rethink their role in society.
So Elena thinks that you must be wrong. She cites an article in the South China Morning Post, and she says, here's an excerpt from this link. Quote, in the eyes of Indonesia's president, Joko Widodo, drug use is a serious problem. Inspired by his Filipino counterpart, Rodrigo Duterte's law on drugs, authorities have been granted shoot-on-sight orders of dealers and traffickers, while lawmakers are introducing increasingly tougher regulations. Yet the world's fourth most populated country remains awash in drugs. Have things perhaps changed since you were there?
I was there last summer. I mean, I would say that they certainly are paying attention to what the Philippines is doing, but having lived there for 3.5 years in the last 25 years and being there the last summer.
Did you do any drugs?
No one does drugs when they're visiting Indonesia.
For good reason, right? They're shoot on sight orders.
Local traditional medicine. But I don't know what to say other than I agree that there are sources you can talk about. They do have a lot of high-profile drug cases that are brought to, and so the Indonesian population constantly hears of the threat of drugs coming from the outside. But knowing local Indonesians that I do, it is simply not the same kind of problem that we have in our own society today with opioids. It just isn't. It's high-profile cases that often do get a lot of political attention in the cities.
But awash in drugs sure reads well, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's because of the kind of draconian efforts that are being taken next door in the Philippines. I think that's having an influence.
Okay, we're going to come right back. Gigi Weix, Mehrdad Kia, John King, Peter Christian. I think I pronounced everybody's name right.
Thank you.
I get
Excellent.
Gold.
It's actually
an A.
Thank you. I don't get kicked out now. We'll be right back.
You're supposed to aspirate the H for Mehrdad.
Mehrdad. Peter does very well.
I see him at the peak with Louis all the time. or with Michelle.
Coffee? Go grab some.
So is the peak every day or every other night?
It is rare when I get to go to the peak now,
Yeah.
because my workload is just unbelievable.
I was going to say that. Yeah.
So basically, what I do when my wife gets home from work at about 4, and so we go together because she doesn't want to go alone. So we'll work out, and then I'll go back, and then the hour that I've taken there, I will have to put on to the end of the day to do my stuff. So, KGVO, this is Peter. Would you like to make a comment this morning?
Well, Peter, I'm kind of in between things here, but wasn't there a problem in East Timor? I don't know if they were trying to.
Yeah. What's your name? We'll put you on.
Well, actually, I'm kind of in the middle of things. I can't really hold. Or if it was a religious headache.
Right. Okay. Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll talk about East Timor when we get back.
Yeah. You know what? I'm ready for MSU's graduation.
Because of your wife?
Wife.
That is a friend.
Yeah. I don't know if she's a friend right now. I haven't seen her.
She's been busy studying. What's she graduating?
She'll be a
Congratulations in advance. I know you have been looking forward to the
we got the
conclusion.
stuff yesterday.
Yeah.
I made her wear them around.
Yeah.
All right, we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number, and we just had a call from a gentleman who couldn't stay but wanted to ask about the situation in East Timor, because that was in the headlines not long ago. Gigi.
Well, East Timor is its own independent country. They were given the chance to vote for independence in '99 after Indonesia had colonized them since 1975. So East Timor today is autonomous, but it has extraordinary relationships with Indonesia because the West Timor, the second half of the island, is still part of Indonesia.
Right next door, yeah.
Right. And they also have still continuing negotiation over oil and other issues. I have friends doing fieldwork now in Timor, up in the highlands, and one thing that they notice is that the island is still culturally unified. I mean, the artificial national boundary in the center of the island does not separate families and villages and people who live there.
You said
it is two nations.
You said artificial natural, and I have no idea what that means.
It means if you go up to the highlands of Timor, you can go back and forth and visit people across this boundary much more easily than we can cross our border.
Is it like you right, like here ends West Timor, or is it just like a wall? Is it like a mountain range, or what is it?
It is just a line on the map.
Okay, so that there is no boundary.
Well, there is a boundary, and people do negotiate it. But the point is, there are still ties of family and
Are there
villages across the island.
Is there like the U.S.-Canadian border, which is much friendlier?
I would say it's closer to the Canadian-U.S. border.
Yeah. So there you will go through, and you're now leaving East Timor, going into West Timor,
of course.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, at roads.
Right. Yeah.
But the Indonesians I knew in Central Java that work at a university, very much like the University of Montana, many of them had jobs in Dili or relatives who worked in Dili, the capital of East Timor. And there were many East Timorese students who studied in Central Java. So it's a working relationship, again, crossing education and other domains that I think is important to recognize that East Timor and Indonesia, even though they were, it was very adversarial, and the rise of East Timor as a national country, as an independent country, did have a lot of violence in the early 2000s.
So, question for you. You had talked a little bit earlier about how America might look at the activities of the government in Indonesia and maybe copy some ideas. And you had mentioned healthcare.
Well, I think it's the other way around. They looked at what we did and said,
so they
public healthcare, let's put it on everyone's phones.
I guess I've also learned that, I've read that like millions have no electricity in their home. Is that I mean, it seems like there's this divide between maybe the cities and maybe the outskirts or something. It's hard for me to imagine having centralized healthcare and no power.
Well, the electrification of Indonesia, mostly in the 20th century, was dramatic, right? It was a population that had less access to infrastructure. But the infrastructure built by the New Order, I will give them credit for that. 100,000 new primary schools, electrification of the rural areas, that continues. Indonesia has always been a country of developing its infrastructure across the islands. And some of the outer islands are very remote, do have less access to infrastructure, but it's a remarkable accomplishment in the world to see a country like Indonesia from the 1960s until today.
Well, try to imagine the logistics of trying to get all that done with the islands, and of course you've got. How do you get transmission lines across water?
Well, they also have other sources of energy and renewables. And
are there any nuclear plants there? Or
there was one I know of. I mean, there are probably more, but it was located where I lived on the north coast of Java, and it was, a very contentious issue to build one in a country that has active volcanoes, fault lines, and it is part of the earthquake ring of the Pacific.
That'll do it. Yeah.
But they deal with these nuclear issues the same way we do.
Right.
It's a local assessment of the safety of putting a plant up on the north coast of Java and the degree to which they're going to rely on nuclear versus other forms of, they have oil, so they don't need to go nuclear as much.
A question for you. So, Republic is kind of a strong ideology. You got China to the north. You had communism very close for many, many years, and apparently there was a mass kill-off inside Indonesia to prevent its spread there. What kind of what reason would you give them for having their kind of independent nature and not getting involved in any of these other ideologies?
I think it's their nationalism, which is, again, one of those accomplishments of the 20th century, and their language. Indonesian as a national language is shared by everyone, and it's promoted through public education. So they have an extraordinary sense of respect and tolerance for difference. Now, that's strained right now with this puritanical Muslim, lobby to try to enforce blasphemy laws, as they did against the governor of Jakarta. He's in jail for 2 years on a blasphemy charge from last year, or the kinds of punishments for gay and
I'm hearing less kumbaya and more.
I'm just being realistic that there are forces that are straining at that tolerance. But for 260 million people to have formed a nation and continue into the 21st century, you have to give them credit.
But let me get this from. So you talked earlier about this wipeout of the communist elements in Indonesia. That doesn't sound like kumbaya either.
No, of course not. And the film The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, these two documentaries that were just released, they're now on Netflix, document it was a massacre of Indonesians by Indonesians, and then the Indonesians who did the killing went on to run the country for 50 years. So the history of that massacre was suppressed and not talked about. When I lived there in the 1980s, it was still a taboo subject to acknowledge that the people who were running the country had murdered their own citizens.
And I don't want to, just building on what John was asking, and I don't want to be controversial, but there was active support for United States, from the United States, for the Indonesian military when Indonesian military was actively involved. And this has been a controversial issue too, right?
Because of 50 years, things were declassified after 2015. It is debated and researched now what the role of the U.S. was in supporting, passively allowing that massacre to occur. And other, since then, in 1980s, there was also a wave of killings, extrajudicial killings. But so Indonesia is grappling with those issues now. And just as I said, they have an anti-corruption commission. Now they also have a commission to discuss what happened in the 1960s and to bring it out and discuss it not as a propaganda process, but as a historical research process. And it's still very painful for Indonesians.
We kind of have that same problem here, except for we call it, dude, what happened in the 1960s?
We're going to take a break. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. You can also, of course, make your comments on our Facebook page. Gigi Weix, Mehrdad Kia, Peter Christian. No, that's John King. I'm Peter Christian, I think. We'll be right back.
Incredibly exciting and refreshing to try to summarize all of this in a few minutes for a radio show. But I really appreciate you all. I can't tell you how much I appreciate being invited, because about 20 years ago, when I first started working here, the radio show invited me, and I thought, great, be on the radio.
Wow.
And it turned out to be a joke. They just wanted an anthropologist to be part of a kind of the butt of the joke. And
no.
I was so disappointed because I had just moved to Montana.
What radio station?
I don't even remember. It was one of those, sort of
like morning show things.
Morning shows. They wanted to talk about evolution, and I was like, "You don't get it.
Wow.
I'm here. I want to be used for education. Please invite me. Debate. Let's talk."
Well, I would be interested to ask you when we come back to talk about your experiences there, because you said you lived there for 3 years.
I did.
And it would be interesting to find out, what you learned. I mean, because you're an anthropologist, you're there to learn, right?
Yep.
So, okay.
Or do drugs.
Yeah.
We can talk about. Let's talk about cigarettes. Okay.
We're back on Talkback right now.
You studied
live.
I did.
Okay, here's a really weird nerd question for you. Have you ever played the board game Indonesia?
No, I didn't know there was one.
He knows all the board games.
I know the Missoula.YouTube.
No, it's not. It's about economics.
Yeah, it's very uneven. You're right about there being isolated parts of the country. And infrastructure is difficult. But
Now let me ask you this: in the game Risk, is Indonesia a powerful country?
It's the southern Australia.
Okay. Yeah.
It's all together. It's the power source. It's the old store up in Australia and explode strategy.
I haven't played Risk since, before my kids were born. And that was 34 years ago. So I'm sure it's probably changed a little bit since then.
Not as much as it should.
Yeah. Sorry, public service announcements.
I mean, most people in America think of Indonesia, they think of Bali.
Uh-huh.
The island of Bali from the South Pacific. Right. I mean, I did the musical in high school.
There you go.
But so the Republic of Indonesia is invisible to them.
Yeah.
It just, they've sort of heard of Java, but they think of coffee. And I don't
what when I think of Java, I think of Krakatoa.
Exactly. I didn't know anything about Indonesia when I started graduate school.
Because Krakatoa is one of the largest
explosions
ever recorded in history. Huge.
That was before my sons were born, though.
But,
do they like that?
You like exploding?
Okay, we're back. You spent a significant amount of time there, and I'm sure it wasn't just to study as an anthropologist, but from just hearing your comments, you really enjoyed your time there.
I did. It's like a second home to me. I spent 2 years in Java, on the north coast of Java, living in a small Muslim town. There was a pilgrimage site there, the grave site of one of the 9 saints of Java, and it was a cigarette town. It was the origin of the Kretek cigarette industry. And I spent 2 years studying the people who worked in the cigarette factories. And I went back there last summer to visit again. And it's extraordinary to go back after 34 years and see how much the place had changed and not changed. But the cigarette industry now is completely automated. And if you talk about drugs, the real drug that most Indonesian men were addicted to was cigarettes. So that to me is much more interesting about how you study the local life and friends and
Gigi, can you tell us about what made you interested in Indonesia? I mean, I know you come from Cornell University, and there was this brilliant professor by the name of Benedict Anderson.
Ben Anderson, but also Jim Siegel in the Department of Anthropology had both worked and written about Indonesia for many years. And they mentored a lot of us to be able to consider doing fieldwork in Indonesia, as well as a lot of Indonesian graduate students who'd come to Cornell to study. So I went to graduate school working with Indonesians as fellow students, and some of our seminars were just held in Indonesian. And I had to study really, really quickly to be able to keep up with the discussion. But so as an outsider, from the United States, living in Indonesia 2 years, you don't become an expert. You just learn from the people, and you keep learning your whole life.
What years were you there again?
1986 and 87. And then I went back and spent a year living in Bali, leading study abroad of American students to Bali.
And when was that?
1990 to 91. I visited again just last summer, and a few other visits in the 90s.
So do you, this is a question from Kitty. She says, can you compare and contrast the attitudes of younger people there and the rest of the world?
Oh, sure. Indonesian students are bright, vivacious, curious, open. Even students that you might think of as devout Muslims and very maybe intolerant views are remarkably open to the world. You know, they want to learn, they want to know about the world. I had more people ask me questions about the U.S. when I lived there. Right? They knew more about us.
What kind of questions did they ask you?
Well, they asked about politics, but they would also ask about local culture. They would ask about family. They would ask about, you know, how people in America make a living. You know, for them, they had an extraordinary wash of TV. They, you know, when I lived there in the 80s, they wanted to know everything about the show Dallas, you know. So you have to think about our television coloring their view of us.
Oh, boy.
I'm kind of curious.
I still don't know who shot JR.
That's right.
When it comes to the Indonesian people now, do you feel they're getting more open or more closed?
I think a little bit of both. You have areas clearly where I think there is a much more intolerant strain of closed view of the world, but I think it's a minority. Most Indonesians I know remain open to the world, and that's one of the things I love about them. Is you go there and they are well informed, they're educated, they're curious, and they're open to understanding and learning about the rest of the world.
So, what is their path forward? What do you see happening in Indonesia? Do you see it becoming more like Australia, more like India, staying the same? It's got an interesting situation in that it's growing population base, I assume. It's kind of smack dab in the middle of all these power centers, and yet it doesn't really carry much sway when it comes to consciousness for most of the other countries in the world.
I think it's one of those unique places where they still see themselves developing in their own national history. So they don't think necessarily of influencing other people. They think about what they're becoming as a country. And they do have ASEAN and their neighbors. They play a role in mediating a lot of conflicts within the ASEAN nation. But I just don't think that Indonesians see themselves as expansionist as people might.
For those of us who read a lot of history about World War II and heard a lot about the Philippines, you know, with MacArthur, I shall return, that sort of thing. What compare and contrast Philippines with Indonesia? You
know, the Philippines' relationship with the U.S., I'm just teaching that right now.
Right,
My students at the university just saw this bloody, blundering business, our own colonization of the Philippines of the first half of the 20th century. And the two just couldn't be more different in terms of relationships to the United States because Indonesia's colonial past was different. But today, as modern nation states, you have to remember these are archipelago nations that have a lot in common with themselves over millennia. Right? Filipino local peoples in the Philippines and local people in eastern Indonesia make their living in the same way. They have a shared past. But then when you get to the national political structure, it's very different because the Philippines institutions were all modeled after the U.S. and Indonesia sort of made it themselves.
Why isn't Indonesia more Hindu or more Buddhist? It seems like it'd be ripe in the area for that, and yet it has this Muslim Catholic. I guess the Catholic
because of the Muslim proselytization in the 14th century of Sumatra and Java. So if you go to Java today, Borobudur is there, Prambanan is there, Bali is still Hindu, but it's only 3 million people out of 260 million. So the Islam that spread to Indonesia was one of a very different kind of eclectic and syncretic Sufi-related branch of Islam. Yeah. And it was one that characterized most of the western half of the country. The eastern half of the country remained animist and then was proselytized by Christians in the 20th century, Catholics in Flores and Timor. So you ask about Hindu Buddhism, that's really 600 years in their past. But it's still there for tourism and for the world heritage sites. You go to Borobudur, they're very proud of the fact that that was built 1400 years ago.
So in sharp contrast to early Islam, which spread by conquest, this came as a result of trade.
Yes. Exactly. Trade and travel along the
even way. The spread of Islam did not was not accomplished by violence or conquest or military domination. So it just, and it had to adjust itself
Yes.
to all the pre-Islamic traditions and customs and beliefs, so the animistic beliefs and the other religious traditions. So from the very beginning, it was forced almost to have a very different attitude in terms of coexistence with other cultures and religions.
The debate over modern Islam in Indonesia is such a fascinating one because it allows for more plurality and it allows for more of a role of education and an absence, really, of a militaristic view of religion.
Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead. Ask your question and we'll take a break.
Well, it was about the nature of Islam in Indonesia. It seems because it's so geographically disjunct from the centers of Islam, and so much of Islam, it seems to be built about a geographic area and your pilgrimages and the sites and all this stuff. It seems like you kind of have to cut part of Islam out in order to transport it to Indonesia.
Indonesia sends one of the largest group of
Contingents to Mecca
pilgrims
every year.
to Mecca for pilgrimage. I mean,
Now, but back then?
Yeah, well, they actually went by boat and ships and every other means. But so the devotion, I think, is there, but in more religious terms than in a political.
And I mentioned local pilgrimage centers in Java. The move to Mecca, for people to take the Hajj really was fueled by the oil wealth of the 70s. So Indonesians prior to the 1970s would often go on pilgrimage among sites in Java rather than going to Mecca because they couldn't get there. Right. But with the rise of the middle they often express their devotion by going on the Hajj when they can, and it's integrated into this local view of religion that's in a very different context.
Okay, we're going to come right back. 721-1290 is our number. If you have a question or comment, give us a call. We have all 4 lines open. We'll be back.
Yeah, I don't want to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of debate problems too, but I just don't think we see their model of life as much as we.
Well, it certainly doesn't seem to stand out. Like if you go and look up Indonesia and Islam, you're going to read the stories about the beatings of the homosexuals.
Yes, those will be
forest hijab. Those are the two that'll pop up.
Right, but I could show you so many other stories about the things that come.
It was quite amazing when their ambassador was here, and somebody said the largest Muslim country, and he immediately came in and corrected it. Says, no, the largest country
with the
largest
percentage.
Muslim population in a country, not a Muslim country.
Well, they did
make sure that the pluralistic aspect of his country was highlighted as the first.
They did kind of fight a war over that, right? Or at least there were some skirmishes over whether or not it would be a Muslim country.
It was more the negotiations between the nationalists in the 40s as they were declaring independence. And Harry Benda's book, The Crescent and the Rising Sun, is about the fact that the Japanese occupation.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
This is good on-air stuff. Not that we're not on air with these guys, but there are a few more people listening on the radio than there are on Facebook.
A few thousand.
I think it's also a good way maybe for the next break, post-next break, for Gigi to talk about classes that we teach at the university, South and Southeast Asian Studies program.
Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, and that's John King over there. I'm Peter Christian, joining us here in studio. Mehrdad Kia, Gigi Weix. She's an anthropologist. See, I can't even say that now.
An anthropanther.
Anthropology professor at the University of Montana. All right, so now we had a fascinating conversation during the break that I think that our listeners would like to know about some of the conflict between the folks in Islam and the conquest and that sort of thing, but there was quite the
and Japan,
and Japan as well, So
well, the struggle over Indonesia's national identity in the 1940s when they were declaring independence was whether or not to become an Islamic state or a secular state. and the secular state model won. But Harry Benda's book, The Crescent and the Rising Sun, documents the effort to try to create an Islamic state that failed. That doesn't mean that throughout the 20th century there weren't still efforts by Muslim Islamicists to impose more influence on the country's democracy. But in every case, it has always been an accommodation of a kind of council, of a kind of influence. Even under its authoritarian regime of the New Order, Muslims were allowed their own political party. They just were never allowed any majority. And through the 90s, as that regime started to crumble, Muslim intellectuals formed councils and started to rise. In 1998, when Suharto resigned, the country went through elections and a democratic process, but there were an extraordinary range of new parties, many of which were explicitly Muslimist. Many more women ran for government.
And wasn't Sukarno's daughter one of the people who
Sukarno became president briefly?
So it had a woman president.
Yeah, the gender politics of Indonesia has always been much more egalitarian.
There's also one other element we haven't talked about on air. You had mentioned to me before the show, actually, the idea that it's one of the few countries where people just have a single name.
Yeah, well, and because their kinship system is so diverse, they have many different forms of kinship, but Java especially, people just have one name. Now, today, the president, Joko Widodo, there's two names. It's more of a modern influence of the world. But many Indonesians, Sukarno, Suharto, just one name. And
that's it. That's not like...
Yeah, that's it.
There's never was a middle, never was a last name.
Never was. Well, and it's because their kinship relations were very shallow.
But when you say kinship relations, what exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about their family structure, or the way that they value their family structure over time?
Well, they value family tremendously, but the terms mother and father are also Mr. and Mrs., sort of sir and ma'am. So the politics of family in Indonesia has always been the way in which people reflect national identity. So ibu and bapak, when you say bu and pak to people for mother and father, those are family terms. They're also terms you address everyone with, right up to the president.
Well, this has got to be heaven for an anthropologist, because the way you dive into all this and how, here, your name is basically your identity. And of course, sometimes it's nice to have a whole bunch of names. That means you're more important, like in Great Britain.
That's why Peter joined the radio, so we could have other names.
Thank you.
If you go to Indonesia, I hope many people have a chance to visit Indonesia and speak English. They study English. They love English. They love to speak with you. But if you learn a few words of Bahasa Indonesia, a few words of Indonesian, then they consider you part of family. You immediately enter into their world as someone who can speak their language.
So there's words for mother and father. Is there a word for, can I have $10?
Minta.
Is minta the word for son?
My students yesterday were reading a wonderful article that says, no please, no thanks in Indonesia. There's no word for please or thanks. The word for please is just help, tolong, or minta, to ask. So, because you don't want to thank people, you want a relationship with them. You don't want to cut it off.
Right.
You want them to have a constant reciprocal relationship.
All right. Well, let's tell you what, we're up against a break. So, Harry, I know you'll have a comment, so I don't want to cut you off. We'll take a quick commercial break, come right back with Harry's call, and we have 3 other lines open. It's 721-1290.
Why did he use such any audio?
I have no idea. Well, it probably is the only place they could get.
He talks all the time. I mean, he's on.
Well, they
you call him up.
I hired the wrong company to do
I guess so.
Although Matt is an extraordinarily wealthy man, from what I understand, so probably self-funded.
Is this Matt Rosendale?
Yeah.
So this Matt Rosendale's commercials are terrible. And his voice is like in the background, like
That's what we're talking about.
yeah.
And then it cuts to the classic Montana voice.
Right. Matt Rosendale. He's a real Baltimore Montanan.
Do you think Montana will ever elect a woman to office? No, I mean to Senate. Representatives.
Well, Jeanette Rankin was the first and only.
We're still waiting after 100 years.
Well, Judy March was governor.
I do.
I think the big problem is that in Montana, women politicians have so long they're going to have a hard time
she'll run? Yeah, but do you think they'll run for the national offices? I just, it's just.
No. Here we go. 10 seconds. Wow, we're talking about anthropology in Indonesia and born in the USA. So I'm not sure where it was just a Bruce Springsteen song. Anyway, 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Privileged to have Gigi Weix joining us in studio, a professor of anthropology, and waiting very patiently on the phone, Harry. Thanks for holding. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. For all the troubles that the West has had with terrorism, seems like the biggest, I mean, it's minuscule compared to what actually is happening in like Afghanistan, Pakistan, these Islamic nations. I'm wondering if Indonesia is having any problems with, their own versions of Taliban or ISIS groups within the country itself.
Good question.
Yes, there have been.
Thanks, Harry.
There are local cells and terrorist groups, and Sidney Jones from Human Rights Watch has documented for the last 30 years the effects of these local cells in both in Indonesia for local incidences of terrorism. There was one in Bali in 2002, which most people remember. Over 200 people were killed in a nightclub. Those are local groups. And so there is terrorism in Southeast Asia. But the question of its relationship to Taliban or ISIS or these transnational movements is always complex because they may claim them as local cells, but sometimes they evolve nationally, locally, and organically.
They had an assassination attempt, didn't they, as well?
I don't know.
On Sukarno?
Oh, well, Sukarno, yes, 50 years ago. I mean, that, but I think more recently, it's much more aligned with U.S. policy, the fight against terrorism. It's just that the local terrorism in Southeast Asia is often much more around local issues and not aligned to.
So the Bali bombing, was that something that was a local issue, or was that a?
No, that was a targeting tourists. That was most of the people who died there were Australian and internationals. So it's a complex issue how terrorist cells in Indonesia target, but they often have local concerns.
So Gigi, there is a Abu Sayyaf, which the terrorist organization in the Philippines.
Yes.
And it has recently sort of joined efforts with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they have more or less declared themselves as Wahhabis, right?
Right.
The followers of the brand of Islam advocated or represented by Saudi Arabia. Is there such a thing, a similar sort of Abu Sayyaf type movement in Indonesia?
The analysis shows from, the local groups, Jamaah Ismaila is one, that they do declare affiliation with transnational movements. But what I'm trying to point out is that they are not always connected to transnational movements and concerns. The work against them happens internally to Indonesia, and the most vulnerable groups are often tourists and international visitors to Indonesia. Those are the people.
Is it almost incidental as to where the attack takes place, as long as there's a large number of international people that they can get headlines from, whether it's in Malaysia, Indonesia, wherever it might be?
So the destabilizing though with the attack on Bali was how much Indonesia depends on tourism, especially from Australia.
Right.
And by attacking those targets, you are undermining the economic vitality of the Indonesian state, but you're also making Indonesia an unpopular destination for tourism. I mean, that's what the terrorists have always wanted.
Okay, let's get Dean on the line. Dean, thanks for holding, sir. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you. I was going to ask you, do you think that it's okay that the United States gets involved in these, conflicts or whatever you want to call it? I mean, or is there any way that they can take care of it themselves?
Take care of the terrorism or what?
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, so
I would say the U.S. is, definitely allied with Indonesia in the global war against terror, but you're right. Indonesia sees itself as addressing the issue internally. And I don't think the U.S. is actively involved in conflicts in Indonesia. There is a real sense, even when the tsunami occurred in 2004, the philanthropy within Indonesia immediately went into effect. And we played a very peripheral role in helping them recover from the tsunami because they saw themselves as addressing it themselves.
Well, let me ask you a question. So you got 13,000 islands in a much fought over part of the world, even though Indonesia itself may not be the subject of many of these incidents. You have the Philippines. We have military base there. Japan expanded down into Indonesia. But I don't hear a lot about the legacy of these imperial powers with their bases. It just doesn't seem to be, even though it's right in the middle of all the trade, why didn't anyone start throwing down their big bases there?
Is there a U.S. base there? Let me ask you that.
No,
okay.
Not in Indonesia.
Okay.
And I just want to put in a plug for our curriculum at the University of Montana to study these subjects. We have a new minor degree in South and Southeast Asian Studies, which studies both India and Indonesia. And we certainly want more American students to have in their history and political science classes some mention of Indonesia because it is unique and interesting that such a large populous country in such an important region does not have much intervention by the U.S. We have much more cooperation and collaboration and work through the State Department, through Ford Foundation. Indonesia and America have had a long-standing history of economic and development and support of democratic structures, but there hasn't been, bases and interventions in the way that a lot of Americans are suspicious of being involved.
Can you explain
in politics.
Can you give me a chance at trying to explain why? Because it just seems like you've got a trade route. Everybody wants to secure trade. Everybody wants to expand power. All these giant countries are around. Why didn't anyone throw a base down there?
I think the Indonesians,
they didn't want them there.
Yeah, there's a sense of sovereignty, of political autonomy. There's much more concern. Alfred McCoy was here from the University of Wisconsin last November to give a presidential lecture about the potential conflicts in the South China Sea, just north of Indonesia. And I think that is much more an area that Americans should be concerned about, in the kind of
where they're building the islands
where China is trying to establish bases. But again, Indonesia to the south is an area that we should know more about and study because it is not at those flashpoints.
Let me ask you this. Again, this is you're not a part of the Indonesian government, but anyway.
No.
So if the United States approached Indonesia and said, may we place a base or a presence there, not exactly within sight, but pretty close, where all these Chinese islands, new islands are being located.
Well, we are in Guam and other places nearby.
But what I'm saying is, would that be seen as being provocative?
I think it's unnecessary. I mean, the collaboration between Indonesia and the United States allows their military and their Navy to provide support if there's need.
Yeah, we have Guam and the Philippines. And South Korea and Japan.
Okay.
Like, we've got a ring of fire there.
I'm just saying, why not cover all of our bases here? And if there's another opportunity there, why not?
Get it, bases.
I think it's more efficient and effective
and cost-effective to have a strong pro-U.S.
democratic allies to provide their own national defense and collaborate with us.
So let me ask you this. So Japan, however much sovereignty the Indonesians might have, the Japanese Imperial Army didn't really care for sovereignty. It wasn't in China, South Korea. They just made what they wanted and took what they wanted. But Indonesia doesn't seem to have this legacy of Japanese animosity. It's not something I read about, but in all the other countries I do.
Actually, there's a wonderful film on Riding the Tiger, the history of the Japanese occupation. The Indonesians see that intervention. The Japanese kicked the Dutch out for 2 years. And even though that time was extraordinarily harsh for Indonesians, a lot of people starved, it was a time of great famine, they also saw it as a moment of their liberation, their ability to become a new nation because of that Japanese occupation. And they link the history and the origin of their military to that era. So after the World War II and they declared their independence, they quickly moved to a very good relationship with Japan.
Before the Dutch could move back in, obviously.
The Dutch tried.
Yeah, I was going to say.
We're
going to take a break, one final time out, and finish this. I want to talk about tourism when we come back, because it isn't often that we say, hey, let's go visit Indonesia.
And when the Dutch tried to come back, that was called the Double Dutch conflict.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be back in a minute. Jeez.
Yeah, I'm sorry not to be able to talk more about Australia. I should have
No.
prepared,
This
but-
is right. The idea is to expose the listeners to different corners of.
Why aren't we even mentioned? Been a whole program.
We will bring them up too.
Thanks for calling KGVO. This is John. Sure, we'll get you on shortly.
Yeah, what we really need is a political scientist on Indonesia on this show, because my knowledge is at the local level.
That's all right.
So it's always a stretch.
You're holding your own, kiddo. You're doing great.
I was trained
10
by
seconds.
I was trained by the best. Ben Anderson. Demanded.
And you will
everyone.
need your headphones for the caller.
Oh yeah.
Good.
Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We've had a great time so far this morning with Mehrdad Kia and Gigi Weix, a professor of anthropology at the University of Montana. We've got Dean waiting on the line. Hi, Dean.
Hi.
Good morning, sir. What's
I
up?
was just curious. Oh, sorry. I was curious why, how come every country or everybody that complains about us are the first people that want our money?
Okay. So has Indonesia been complaining about us?
Not at all. The Indonesians are really proud and interested in the United States, and you don't see Indonesians complaining about the United States. They also don't ask for aid. They're very proud of the fact that their national development is their own project. While there is a lot of collaboration through the U.S. the past 70 years, it's not a country that's asking for help in the sense that you mean it.
Okay, question for you. It's not really about Indonesia. It's about anthropology and you.
Yes.
Oh, why? Well, why did you pursue this course? Why is this an interesting topic for you? What motivated you to get into this?
Well, my teachers at Cornell had worked in Indonesia for many years, and they, I knew nothing about Indonesia when I started graduate school. And so the more I learned about it through them. And it really becomes a place where local friendships really form. For me, going to Indonesia, it was very strange and different. I grew up in Wisconsin, I ended up in Java. It didn't ever occurred to me that I would live among Muslims in a pilgrimage site, working in a cigarette factory. But Indonesians were so open and friendly and adopted me in that sense and taught me, what it means to treat people like relatives. And they've always, welcomed me. Every time I've gone back, I've been just treated like family. And it's just been a lifetime of learning about a place that I love.
How would you describe anthropology? What is the definition of it? Because in my mind, it's like a hybrid between archaeology
Sure.
and social studies. I mean, I guess it's kind of hard for me to pigeonhole it as far as a field of study. So, what would you describe it as?
It was a study of humanity, right?
It's the study of humanity. And the difference between archaeology and what I do is that we go and live with people for a long period of time, learn their language, live with them, eat with them, and just know their way of life from the inside, from what they're willing to share with us. And, it's not just anthropologists that do that, ethnographers. It's also people in missions go and live in places for a long time. Even people in the army who are based somewhere for a long time, they are doing a kind of anthropological process of learning and living in another culture, and until they feel comfortable in that culture and they feel like it's something.
Which is why I'm proud to announce we've got a special funding to get Peter to live in Bozeman as a cat for a couple years.
I think
just
not.
try it out.
I think not.
But,
So
let's talk
Gigi,
about
can you
tourism a
also
minute.
talk about the tourism?
Yeah.
Tourism, tourism is a little bit like short-term anthropology, where you just go for 2 weeks and enjoy the place. A lot of my students like to plan trips to Indonesia, and I always try to help them have a good experience when they go there, to not just go to hotels and tourist spots, but to live with local people and learn about the place in an ordinary way as well. And I encourage anyone who has the opportunity to travel and live with places to talk to anthropologists.
Are there Airbnbs in Indonesia?
Oh, absolutely. Everything's on the cell phone now.
Ah,
and
okay.
Indonesians have long opened, their country to tourism, especially in places like Bali, Central Java. But also there's a lot of cultural tourism out to the outer islands where people want to study the culture. They want to see the cultural rituals. And so that is actually a real source of revenue for Indonesia. And it to me, it just fosters more understanding.
Is it expensive?
No, it's not. It's expensive to get there.
Yeah.
You have to fly there. But once you get there, it's a question of whether if you learn a little bit about the place before you come, then you can, I always send my friends, my students to my friends. And
Gigi, what courses do you teach that include, or do we teach at the University of Montana, which includes Indonesian history, culture?
I'm currently teaching a class called Peoples and Cultures of the World, Indonesia and the Philippines. And we also have courses at the 1 and 200 level, Introduction to India, Introduction to South and Southeast Asia. We're slowly building a curriculum that's interdisciplinary, open to all students.
Okay, aside from the cigarette factory, what was the most awe-inspiring thing you saw in Indonesia?
Any sunrise over Borobudur is just amazing to see.
It's right there on the ocean too. Right? Since you're quite literally surrounded by ocean. What the heck, right? So and Bali High, right, from South Pacific. You said you were in the musical.
Well,
in high school.
Bali is more well known than the Republic of Indonesia.
Right.
Most Americans know the song Bali High from the South Pacific musical, which is really about the Pacific.
Right.
But we don't know much about Indonesia, and we should learn more.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have some local ambassadors heading over there. We have exactly 1 minute left in the program, so if folks want to find out more, maybe are there any Mali classes with what you folks do?
There aren't yet, but that would be a good thing to start. I also really enjoy coming out on the radio to talk to your listening public, to say they're always welcome to come to the University of Montana, to contact me if they have questions.
Can we sit in on a class?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, cool.
You can sit in on any one of my classes you'd like.
If you know how to balance a budget, they're looking for people.
It's free because I'm on salary there.
Well, there you go.
Just come and learn.
As long as we bring cookies, right?
I'll provide the cookies.
Okay, that works. Okay, John, what's coming up on tomorrow's fabulous program?
I have no clue. It's open phones.
All right. So thanks again to Mehrdad and Gigi for being with us. And thanks for all of your calls. We had quite a few calls today, and you made it great. And we hope to see you tomorrow morning at 8:30 for open phones. Of course, Montana Morning is on at 6 o'clock with yours truly. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy.